Hello chess enthusiasts. Welcome to part 2 of the series Best Opening Against e4. Today, I share with you a lichess study on the Owen's defense, where we are going to see some extra variations of this opening. Ready? Let's go. e4, we go for b6. d4, and then bishop b7 normally played as we saw in part 1. Knight c3, and then e6 to open the diagonal of the black square bishop. That's simple so far as we saw the same pattern in part 1. Of course, the next move is bishop d3, and then knight f6 to add some pressure to e4. Queen e2 and then d5, but here pay attention. There are two options for the white side. First option, the exchange, where we put pressure to the knight. Second option, e5, where we push the knight backwards. We open the position with c5 and knight c6 follows. It's high time for something new. What do we play against d4? We use the same logic, and we lead our opponent to similar patterns to the previous ones. Let's go forward. It's exactly the same position. First move, knight f6. Our opponent wants to play the ready opening, for which I have talked about in one of my latest videos, so check it out. Anyway, we respond with the Owen's defense, pawn to b6. d4, bishop g7, another interesting transposition. So after the pin of the dark square bishop and the advance of the white bishop, we don't capture on e4 immediately as indicated by the arrows. However, we finally gain an advantage as we play knight f6, and in the next move we get the knight. When white recaptures, we grab the pawn on e4 either with the bishop or with the knight. Black is +1 in material. If your opponent plays bishop d2, you capture it. After queen captures d2, you capture the knight on f3. You just created double pawns, while having an advantage in material. However, your opponent gained an open file on the king side. Paradoxically, the engine wants us to castle, which should be such a risky decision. Our next variation is the Smith's gambit. In that case, white sacrifices the pawn on e4. We continue making trades to devastate our opponent's winning chances. So simple. The next pattern is more interesting. Here white pins our knight on f6, so what do? Firstly, we play h6 to kick the bishop away. In this study, the risky g5 is proposed, which basically opens the king side. Was h6 better than bishop e7? Indeed it was, because then we grab the pawn on e4, and we get the advantage again. Here I interrupted the study of the Owen's defense to show you the difficult variation of knight c3. The difference between the normal and the difficult variation is that after the opening's development, black pushes a pawn on e5. So after this move, the plan is to maintain a closed position. The knights are on the back of the pawn chain, and the c-file is semi-open. Thus the position is good enough for the black pieces. Next variation, d4, b6, c4 and bishop b7, fostering the queenside fianchetto. After e6, white plays f3, pretending to play e4 in order to prevail at the center. If you play g6 against d4, that's no longer called Owen's defense. To be precise, it's called English defense, and it transposes easily to the Owen's defense. After the pin on c3, white plays e4, but then you give a check with your queen. No matter what your opponent plays, you maintain the queen on the h-file, and then you put it on a5 to add even more pressure to the white knight. Even though the previous variation seems to be good enough, it has several inaccuracies. This one is more precise. After knight c3, instead of playing e6, knight f6 is far stronger than e6, as it blocks the potential squares of the white knight. Knight f3 is very common here. To face it, we play e6. Possibly, black is going to foster a fianchetto to the king side. Our plan is to pin the knight. Bishop d2, bishop captures knight, and so we make the exchange. Our priority is to castle to protect the king. Notice that it's very rare for the blacks to castle first in this opening, so that's a chance to have the edge over. Two options here. First option d5, second option d6, which is less aggressive. d6, however, is less complex. If white castles, we connect the knights and we prepare a strong initiative to attack. The next variation is my favorite. It's the English opening beginning with c4, continuing with knight c3, and after the queenside fianchetto transposing with d4. When e6 is played, White plays a3 to avoid the pin of the previous variation. It's important then to play knight f6 to equalize the white knight. d5 will be played by whites though, because this opens the position for the white side. In that case, we blockade the pawn with the bishop and then knight f3 follows. That's another variation in which black castles first again, so I would highly recommend you to play g6 against d4 and c4. But if you want to try something new, check my old video, Best Opening Against d4, where I present the old Benoni. Last variation for today. What do we play against a kingside fianchetto? Of course, after g6, we play knight f6 and then bishop b7 to ensure that our rook is safe. e3 and e6 is the most common continuation here. White castles, knight f6, d4 and d5 to occupy more space. After knight c3, you play bishop e4 to attack, unless you prefer bishop e7, which is more defensive. That's the end of my video. See you in my next video. Goodbye.